Okay, I think people are going to keep pouring in. So, hello everyone. Good evening, and welcome to Talks at Tandem. I am Angelina. I am a research fellow at Tandem Research, and I primarily work in the AI Society program. So, for those of you who are joining us for the first time today and or are not well acquainted with her work, Tandem Research is an interdisciplinary research collective. We are based in Goa, and we work at the interface of technology, society, and sustainability. You can check some of our recent work, which will be posted on links to which will be posted on the chat below. So today is the third talk in our series of Talks at Tandem. We had designed Talks at Tandem with the idea of, hosting an open and in-depth discussion around some of the new and rigorous research that is emerging on the interface of tech and society in India, which is relevant to the, tech policy scape. So today's talk is on the topic of data governance, and more specifically on the topic of who drives data in data-driven governance, which is also the title of the paper co-authored by Rajesh Hanbal, Amit Prakash, and Janaki Srinivasan. And we are very happy and excited to have Rajesh and Janaki join us today to present their work, as well as Nupur Raval, who's also joining in as the discussant for their presentation. So we'll be posting a more longish bio on the chat, but by way of introduction, let me just quickly start with Rajesh. Rajesh Hanbal is a PhD scholar at the International Institute of Information Technology in Bangalore. His research explores the role of digital technologies in shaping the state's transparency to its citizens and in everyday interactions. Prior to this, Rajesh also worked with IT for Change and was part of their community radio and participatory video initiatives in Mysore. Janaki Srinivasan is associate professor at Triple IT in Bangalore, and also an affiliate of the Institute Center for Information Technology and Public Policy. Her work has really helped show, how gender, caste, and class in India shape India's digital inclusion initiatives, and she's focused on community computer centers, mobile phones, and identity systems. Currently, she's also exploring aspects of digitally mediated work, primarily from the lens of privacy, automation, politics, and the role of intermediaries. And joining Janaki and Rajesh is Nupur, who is a postdoc research fellow at the AI Now Institute. Her work is placed at the intersection of information science, anthropology, and science studies. And she earned her PhD from the University of California, Irvine, and her PhD focused on gig economy platforms and the transformations that they bring about in how we live, work, and relate to one another ethically. So thank you, Rajesh, Janaki, and Nupur for joining us today. And we're all eager to get started, but before we begin, a couple of house rules. So the Q&A session, which will be towards the end of the session, will not be recorded, and it'll be under Chatham House rules, which basically means that you're free to use the information for your own purposes. However, you're not free to disclose the source of the information. The rest of the talk will be recorded, and we will be putting up the recording online on our YouTube channel. So if you want to revisit it at a later point. Also, I would request I'd request all participants to post their questions on the Q&A tab that you see below, and reserve the chat for discussions, commentary, so that it's easier for me to also kind of pass through all of your questions and makes it So please try and reserve your post your questions on the Q&A. Alternatively, if you want to also ask your questions directly, then you can use the raise hand function, which if you click on the participants tab, you're going to see on your right hand corner. I think those are all the rules. And also thanks to Harsh and Joanne for organizing this talk. So without any further talk from me, I open the floor to you, Rajesh and Janaki.
Thank you, Angelina. Thank you, Tandem Research, for organizing this initiative, and welcome to everyone who has shown interest to be part of this conversation. So let me quickly begin. The title of my talk is "Who Drives Data in Data-Driven Governance?" And this is a paper that we presented recently at the International Conference on Theory and Practice of Electronic Governance. My talk has two parts, essentially. In the first part, I'm going to be setting the context of data-driven governance, and then I'm going to get into who drives it. So let me begin. Now, this is one of the recent newspaper articles which talks about one of India's largest public, in fact, world's largest public work program, which is the NREGA. And for those of you who might not be familiar about it, very quickly, what it refers to is a government program, as part of which it's a livelihood security program. So if a rural citizen is not finding employment, then he or she can go to the local government, demand that he or she wants to work, and they have to be provided work. Now, I'll be referring to this again and again, but then here quickly, what is the context I want to set is that there's a lot of discussion around data of NREGA, right? So for example, this article talks about the NREGA signal. It says that data suggests that young workers are increasingly turning to the screen, and it is a sign that must really worry policymakers. And the data that they're referring to is the data that's available on the dashboard, on the NREGA dashboard. And it is something like this. You don't really have to bother about what it is, but just to get you a sense of the amount of data that is put up there. It is not just the newspaper articles and journalists, but also government within is thinking of these kinds of using that huge database to develop indicators, in a sense of having a proxy indicator. For example, in this context, the assumption that government policymakers think is that if there's an increased demand for NREGA, that in turn means that there's a lot of distress, right? And something else needs to be done about that. And general policy discussions among activist groups and academias generally, even in government, has been on some of these questions. Right? So these questions might not per se interest us, but the reference to data here is what we are concerned about. For example, there's a discussion on the temporal trends, as in there are certain months where NREGA sees an increased demand for work. Does that mean that they are not finding employment somewhere else? What are the spatial trends? Are dryland regions finding greater demand for work as part of this program? What is the demographic trend? For example, the article was referring to youth coming to NREGA. Similarly, to what extent does it include is scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, women, right? And in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, extraordinary events such as COVID-19 or even the drought, does it lead to increased demand, and what should be done about it given all the migrant crisis that we saw? The technology part is also conversations around what does Aadhaar do, given that there is a digital identity and there is a direct benefit transfer program. Does it reduce delays or does it not reduce delays? What does it do essentially? And more recent discussion has been on, do we need an urban version of NREGA? Now, this is, this uptake of data in government and by government is not limited only to NREGA. There are a lot of other programs. Data.gov is now a norm in most countries, especially as part of the open government data movement. You have data of drinking water, sanitation, school education, health, nutrition, various different data sets being put up online, and various interesting APIs and visualizations around that. And even globally, there is a recognition of the role of data in governance. This is the UN Expert Advisory Committee in the context of Sustainable Development Goals, talking of how data is the lifeblood for decision making, and we need high quality data on right things at the right time so that we can have effective policies. Now, given all this interest of data and governance, this is more like the data life cycle if we are going to think about it. And this optimism of, especially of government policymakers and thinkers, has often been tempered by a significant pushback. Critiques have been there, especially from the data justice, conversations on data justice. So I'll quickly run you through where I'm situating my work. Now, to begin with, information system is designed, and in the design of an information system, often the critique is that it includes certain attributes, it excludes certain attributes. So what gets left out and what gets included, and there is, who gets a say in what gets included and what gets excluded. So that is one aspect of it. And once the information is designed, there is the actual process of data production, which is a mundane, everyday, banal process. We will come to that. But once the data is produced, it is published. And critics here have often been about, especially the traditional freedom of information or right to information movement has been talking of to what extent does government publish information and to what extent does it not. And more recently, the open government data movement has been talking about how data is not available, or how only a part of the data is available, right? And then you have the issues around data access, and especially the open data movements here, which talk about a slightly more technical aspect of it, which is that the data is there, but it cannot be used. It is either in the form of PDFs or it cannot be accessed through an API, right? So they are looking at liberating data and to make it more accessible. And then there are issues of, and once, even if the data is accessible, you need to make sense of it. You need to interpret that, you need to process that, and use it. So the process part here is the question again is, does it create a data divide, right? There's been a lot of literature on how this data, you need certain kinds of resources and skills, and whom does it empower? Does it again empower only the empowered, or what happens? Essentially politics around that. And finally, data use. Here the conversation again is on, so what? Like, even if data is available, does it mean that we can negotiate better with the government? Does it necessarily lead to accountability on its own? And also questions of privacy and who is accessing, who is using this data, who is putting it to use, right? So in all this, my key interest is in looking at essentially. I feel that a lot of attention has been paid to most of the other aspects. My interest is in looking at how does data come into existence. Once you have an information system, like how does it actually come in? How does data become essentially? And so broadly, my research design is an ethnographic case study based on a lot of semi-structured interviews and participant observation. And the case that I am looking at is the case of India's livelihood program, which is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which is what I referred to earlier. And the fieldwork was for a little more than a year, between February 2019 to 2020. And the location, the site was a dryland district in rural Karnataka. So quickly, this is what the program looks like. Partly that there are these rural citizens who say that they are not finding employment. They go to the local government, they demand for work, and as part of it, they are given these kinds of works. The works here involves, typically what you are seeing on the left is a desilting of a lake. On the right, what you see is a drain, right? So these kinds of works are done, public works are done. And the assumption there is that one, because of the wages that are paid, their livelihood is taken care of, especially for the most marginal sections, especially for the landless farmers. And the other aspect of NREGA is also the enhanced agricultural productivity. Out of creating assets such as this one, the assumption is that there is going to be greater water security, there is going to be greater soil conservation and all that. A third aspect of it, which is also of interest to us, is that NREGA especially has been designed from a very strong rights-based perspective. Unlike, public works program has always been there, even during the colonial times. But what separates NREGA from the earlier program is that it is more a right, and citizens have a say in various different processes involved. For example, they are supposed to get to decide what kinds of works are taken up, what kinds of grievance mechanisms exist. So essentially, it has a very strong emphasis on participatory processes. And the panchayat, in the Indian context, Gram Panchayat is the local government, and the elected local government has a significant role to play in this entire process. Now, there are various different programs which are of interest, but why study NREGA for me is the relevance of the program and the discussions around data and the program, especially the digital data and the program, given that it addresses issues of livelihood. The other aspect is certainly the availability of data. NREGA has a real-time transaction-based information system. What this means is that there is very little delay between data actually being produced and it being available to almost anyone, right? And it uses various different kinds of very interesting artifacts, technical artifacts, from biometric to GPS to mobile apps. Almost any kind of technical artifact that you can think of, NREGA employs most of it. And it has a significant outlay, like it's pretty huge. And as we are speaking about, 12 million individuals are most likely to have turned up at the work sites today, right? Now, what is the official process? I'm simplifying it. There are far too many steps, but I'm simplifying it for the sake of our discussion. It starts with citizens going to the local government and demanding work. And then whatever you see in red is the digital artifact, right? Now, once people go and demand for work, then the local government receives the application and it locks it in the information system, which is called the NREGA soft. And then the local government links this demand for work with one of the works, a drain or desilting lake or roads or any such program. It links it with one of the approved works and tells them that, hey, work is available. You can come and work from this date. Now, citizens go and work, as we saw in those images, and their attendance is marked in what is called a muster roll. Along with it, a geotagged image is taken, and that is uploaded. This is to ensure that we are not doing, there is no corruption, and we are not doing this. We are not digging the same well again, as it is often alluded in many circles, right? So this is the what is called the Geo MJ-NREGA. And then once this is done, the payment process starts. The payment is also online. There is a separate information system called NEFMS. A wage list is generated saying these 15 people work for these X number of days and they're going to get this much money. And the money is directly credited into a citizen's bank account. What government calls as direct benefit transfer. And there's a role for Aadhaar also in all this. Now, this is the officially stated process, and these are the different artifacts. What you see on the left is the biometric approval by the officials, saying, at every phase, the officials need to give their biometric signature. And on the right, what you see is the GPS, the geotagging that I was mentioning about, right? And this is the information system. There is more. Now, my field work, I engaged with various different kinds of events. I try to engage with as many possible actors, both formal and informal, as possible, and a whole host of officials, wage seekers, as well as elected members, and attending different kinds of events which are not just formal. For example, I was also trying to hang out at the village, typical village temple, for example, to look at what kinds of discussions happen. Now, let me quickly get to my findings. I'm laying out my finding this way. I'm first looking at who produces data. And when we talk of data-driven governance, who are the actual people who produce it? And my critical site here is the Gram Panchayat office. Gram Panchayat is the lowest tier of elected local government. And then I'm moving to whose data is actually being produced. Whatever the names that we see in those different rows and columns, who are those people and what do they have to say about their data getting represented this way. And then I'm looking at who uses the data. I'm here primarily concerned with the block, which is the taluk and district panchayat, essentially officials here. This includes engineers, civil engineers, MIS coordinators, different actors here, but actors who are monitoring this data at that level. Now, the site of data production, which is the Gram Panchayat office, the local office. Now, one thing is that when I began my field work, I went in with a naive assumption that if I'm going to be sitting in the Gram Panchayat office, there are going to be wage seekers who are going to come and demand and who are going to say that, hey, I need work, and they will be provided work, and I'm interested in looking at what happens in the computer there. But what I found to be interesting is that in my entire span of 1 year, I did not find any single wage seeker come and demand work. So it was largely about 20 to 22 people whose names I became very familiar with later on. They were the ones who would come to the Gram Panchayat for anything related to NREGA, right? Now, what is also interesting is, and this group is what I'm calling local elite, and I'll come to them, but essentially for me, the wage seekers are missing. Now, the other interesting aspect is that the data entry operator who actually enters data on a typical computer in the information system, he or she, and most often it's a she, does more than just entry of data. Right. For example, the conversations are around these elites keep asking, have you done MIS? They use the word MIS. Then they say, has the PDO? PDO is the Panchayat Development Officer, the highest official at the Panchayat level. Has the PDO given thumb? By this, they refer to biometric. And then they say, has the GP been done? GP is GPS. The abbreviation, they call it GP being done. So, so what I found interesting, and I'll quickly share. What I found is that there is an arrangement that is there. The arrangement is something like this. These elites, whom I refer to as elites, most of them, not most, all of them are men, and they are either current elected members or ex-elected members of the Gram Panchayat, or they are party workers, right? So what they do is that they get the work done using machinery, which is actually illegal as part of the rules, but which provides them about 80% savings on the labor cost, as it is budgeted by NREGA. Now, if it costs 1 lakh is the labor budget, then they get it using the earth movers. You can get that done in 20,000 rupees, right? And however, they need to show that people actually work. So they enter into a colluding arrangement with the citizens. And the other problem here is that the money directly goes to these 15, 20 people who are shown to be working. So they need to have an arrangement with them to ensure that those people actually withdraw the money and give it to these local elite. So this is at the center of the entire process of data production as I saw it. And what is also important is that it is not like anybody can go and get, invest money and reap profits. You need to know the process of data production. Now, one of the, I'll quickly highlight a few vignettes. One of the conversations that I saw was this whole thing of add these job cards, right? For example, Ramnahalli Krishnappa, he walks into the Gram Panchayat office, into the data entry operator's desk. He opens a stapled book containing a list of works, which is in the action plan. He scrolls through them. He selects a drain work, which he says is about 3 lakh rupees. Then he opens a note from his pocket containing a list of job card numbers. He then asks the data entry operator to check if their % days is available. What he is referring to here is that there is a 100-day quota for every household. And he's saying, are the % days available? Can you please check? The data entry operator diligently looks up the information system, MIS, on her computer and tells him which ones are available and which ones are exhausted. The data entry operator would look up online and say, no, don't add these people because there is a problem. Their job card is not linked to the Aadhaar and it's not linked to the bank account. So don't link these people. So the data entry operator does more than merely data entry, and this is one key aspect of data production. And once this is done, data actually begins to come into existence. The other thing is also, however, the process is not always hunky-dory. There are challenges. For example, there is often a shortage of job cards. Now, another member is referring, is complaining that there is a shortage of job cards, and essentially what this means is that he has used all the quota, 100 days quota, and he has done different kinds of works, spent it on all that. Now, so he is a little upset that all the quota is exhausted. So the data entry operator says, hey, don't worry. Actually, in the Shantipura village, the job cards are not used. Why don't you call the Shantipura member, elected member, and ask if you could use that? And he follows up with them, right? So again, there are some challenges in this entire process, which, for example, another elected member, Nagraj, he was complaining to me that the problem is that not all people have niyat. When he says people, he's referring to the wage seekers or the names of people who are colluding with him, who are expected to later on withdraw money and give it to him. So he says that it requires a lot of effort to recover money from some of them. Last time, some people, they didn't give me the money and they lost about 6,000 rupees. But I could recover it somewhere else. There is no limit to how much work is possible. Only our capacity and limitation. Only our capacity is the limitation. So two other interesting aspects here, which influences actually the data production. One is this word capacity keeps coming up. Capacity is an elected member's financial capacity to invest, and also the capacity to actually, get into a colluding arrangement with whosoever data is actually being input, right? So not everybody has this capacity. Now, the other aspect is that the local elite are expected to do more than just give those names. For example, what you are seeing here is the geotagging, a local official, which is the barefoot technician, taking an image saying these people actually worked. So I went with this lady, BFT Lakshmi, and the member Sudhakar to his village to geotag the work sites. This was a drain of rupees 3 lakh. And this is what is referred to as a during photo, during in quotes. BFT asked for a few laborers to come and stand on the road because she has to capture a during photo. The work was already done by them. Sudhakar got a few people to come, but BFT also suggested that she needed a few equipments, sand or cement preferably. Finally, they got a basket which looked like a construction equipment. A couple of them tied their towel on their head, which is typical of how construction workers are assumed to look like. One of the women was smiling and looking at the camera. The BFT asked her to turn the other way so that it would look natural, and she complied. She then took the photos through the app, added the work code, and uploaded it. And data is actually produced. Data has come into being. Now, I'm also interested to see, what do the people whose data it becomes, what do they have to say about this process, right? So I tagged along with the social audit surveys where they go to every household whose name is included as part of the wage list, who are shown to have worked in the NREG and shown to have actually got the wages. So this is the conversation. The social audit team says, are you Narsim Reddy? Have you worked in any of this lake desilting work? Narsim Reddy says, I don't remember which one. The social audit person says, hey, it is a job card scheme. Have you withdrawn money and given it to anyone? Says, oh yes, Ramesh had asked for my job card. He later came, I withdrew the money and gave it to him. I don't know much about all this. So the social audit member says, okay, sign here. This is a proof that you have got money and that I have come here. Now, to look at also people who I thought were excluded, I went to the local labor market. Labor market is actually a road in this particular town where all the people assemble early in the morning who want to work assemble early in the morning, and local agricultural owners and construction people from the construction domain, they come and they have an arrangement with them, right? So here in the labor market, I was speaking to one such person, Ram Reddy, who was complaining that not much work is available in this season in the month of March. So I asked him, have you worked in the NREGA? So he said, what is that? Taking a cue from the previous experience, I said the job card scheme. So I said, oh, that, okay, I haven't worked in that particular scheme as work is not been available. There are a lot of people in our panchayat who want work, but it's not available. Nothing happens without commission. There is no use of applying for work at all. Now, the third interesting set of people who also shape data production is the higher officials. And here I'm referring to, as I said, the engineers, the executive officer, and other people who sit in the taluk and district panchayat. Here, what is very interesting is that though they are not actually, producing data, they very much shape the data production process. Here, the emphasis is more on the need to show progress. For example, the technical coordinator, who is the head of all the engineers, the civil engineers assigned to NREGA, he says, Harish, do at least 6 works, if 10 is not feasible. The engineer says, doing so much work is problem. The Gram Panchayat members in this GP, they are not at all cooperative. They're not very cooperative. So then his boss says, hey, get hold of people, manage that. Madam is asking for update. I cannot reduce it too much. And these higher officials, one of the higher officials told me, as I introduced myself and began this conversation, that she said, no, this time she very proudly said, we have increased the percentage, the PDs by 15%. This time we have asked for, X lakh PDs. So this demand, essentially this need to show performance, also pretty much drives the demand, so to say. Now, what does all this mean, right? So this is what does the data say in data-driven governance? And what you see on the left, the coverage, timeliness, and inclusivity, these are common discussions that are often used to gauge, to assess how NREGA is performing across different places. For example, we are interested in coverage, and we are looking at, before I got into my field work, I selected a panchayat based on this aspect, looking at which households have demanded more work, where is more employment generated, and what are the temporal patterns. However, a situated understanding by all the local actors is that this coverage depends largely on what they say niyat, which is the and capacity of the local member, right? And also wherever there is greater cooperation among elected members, there is greater work. However, occasionally there is party politics and there is friction, and there is lesser work done as part of NREGA. So that is actually what. So it was so clear that they would clearly tell me, hey, this panchayat, they have a lot of capacity there. People have deep pockets and there's huge coverage. So there's a different interpretation or different understanding of what the data actually says. Now, similarly, timeliness, right? We are very much interested in, NREGA says that it promises that payment should happen within 15 days of people working. And if that does not happen, then they're entitled for a delayed compensation. And if they're not paid beyond a particular time, then they're entitled for an unemployment allowance. So a lot of discussion is around how well this is happening externally, right? Now, especially questions around Aadhaar. Does Aadhaar linking make it more efficient? Does it reduce the time? There were claims by government that Aadhaar linkage actually reduced, brought in a lot more timeliness, which a lot of our very committed civil society activists were pushing back. So in this context, payment is always timely, as long as the relations are well maintained. The only reason why payment might not happen on time is where the selected member or the member has some kind of a friction with the other local elite. Otherwise, payment and all the issues that often are cited, all of them are addressed here very efficiently. So payments always largely happen on time at the local level. Now, the other interesting aspect is the inclusivity. The first slide I was referring to how youth demand has been going up. So similar analysis is often done to look at what is the share of marginal sections. For example, female labor force participation. Are they also able to participate and all that? Now, a situated understanding is that inclusivity is one, it is based on loyalty is a rough translation of niyat, but you are included, you are shown to be having participated in the program if you are willing to collude with me and you demonstrate loyalty, like in the sense that you withdraw the money, you actually give it to me. There are a lot of people who just withdraw the money and they don't return it to the elected members. So those people are excluded as part of this data set. The other key consideration, like in fact, the key consideration for for this metric here is a very pragmatic consideration such as bank linkage. I am interested in, a member is interested in putting so many accounts. The data entry operator will clearly say which of the job card numbers are clearly linked to the Aadhaar, and everything is fine. In the sense that when the payment happens, things are actually fine, right? The other aspect is how near the bank is. If they have a bank account somewhere very far off, they're not interested in including them because you want to take everybody together to the bank, withdraw the money, and give it. So that seems to be what is shaping who is included and who is excluded. Now, to conclude with these thoughts, when we say demand-driven program, NREJ is supposed to be demand-driven program, and a lot of analysis is based on what the data says. And here the assumption is that wage seekers, citizens are going and requesting for work or demanding for work. But in all this, we are not sure if that is the only source of demand. It looks like the demand is also equally from the local elite members, their interest in making money, and also in the higher officials' interest in showing that no work has been done. Occasionally, it could probably also be citizens groups collectivizing and actually demanding work. But it is clearly not, in certain locations, it is clearly not what it looks like. Also, the agency for data subjects, whose data becomes part of this MIS, they seem to have very little agency in this entire process. They are either included or excluded, often excluded, and we are not very clear, if they have any agency at all. So data is always produced by social actors, and it depends a lot on this configuration between the local elite, between the citizens, and between the higher officials. Now, and when we are talking of data driving governance, an interesting definitely question to look at is when we take data itself to be very sacrosanct, then and assume that that itself will lead to better policies, then what does it obscure, right? What tensions beneath the entire production of that data before we see the rows and columns on the MIS, what does it actually obscure? And where do we go from there, right? So those are open questions. Just just to flag this, that these are some of the discussions that are often happening around data and governance. For example, government is looking at monitoring government schemes in real time. There is an interesting, Disha portal that is developed. The government is also looking at a Center for Data Analytics. Given that there's a lot of uptake for data-driven governance, what do we do with the politics of data protection? How do we manage that? So yeah, I'm going to pause here and yeah, over to you, Angelina.
Great. Thanks. That was a really insightful presentation, and I've read the paper as well. And I think what it really kind of drives home for me is that, often we forget that any kind of digital infrastructure or information system is embedded in, what anthropologists would call local moral worlds, basically sites where there are people and institutions with their own history, politics, with their own agency and different kind of power dynamics in which these get embedded. And I think what it is really telling, what your work is really telling of is, the disparities between the claims of large numbers and what actually transpires on the ground. So I am conscious of the time a little bit, but at this point, if there are any clarificatory questions, please feel free to ask them. And I'll pause here for a minute to see if any questions come in. And post that, Nupur, we'll move on to you and get your thoughts and perspectives on the paper. So I'm just going to give it a minute to see if there are any questions that come in. At this point, I'll only take up clarificatory questions, and any other questions that come up, we'll take it up after Nupur's intervention. I think there is one question from Vishal, which I think is not, it can be answered right now. So Vishal's asking, for citizens who actually undertake public work, what is their source of livelihood if they withdraw the credited amount and hand it over to the local elite?
Yeah, so quickly, it is not the citizens who actually undertake public work who would withdraw money and give it. So these people that I am referring to, they are not necessarily, they are not actually working. They are not undertaking the public work, right? So they are paid the standard norm. There is about 200 to 50 rupees because the work is done largely by the missionary, by the earth-movers. But given that they are also investing their time, they're agreeing to collude, coming to the bank, they're paid, an incentive of about 250 rupees.
Okay, so I think it's safe to move to Nupur's now. I don't see any more questions coming in. So, okay, there's a last minute question from Tane. Did you observe any demands for data from the local elite that might help hold high levels of administration more accountable for delay in payments, etc.?
No, as in, I actually did not see there, not accountability in the sense that, it is generally understood, but there, especially about 2 years back, there was a time where throughout India, there was a fund crunch and the delays were happening. So as long as everybody is, the local elite, others are also not getting the money, they were complaining, but they were not going to take that up much with higher officials. Because a lot of the issues are also center state, right? The funding comes from the central government. And these people understand that if the money has not come from the central government, there is not much. And since that none of them have got money, so they complain, but there's not much of accountability that they can demand. And when it is from the local government, it always happens on time. It largely happens on time.
Great. Okay, so there I'll take just 2 more questions, and then we'll take the rest of the questions after we've had Nupur's discussion. So a question from Radhika: did you notice any discomfort or issues raised by women in particular during the geotagging or photo taking process?
No, none at all. In fact, they were all very familiar with each other. They seemed to be treating each other with a lot of warmth, and there was no discomfort. No, they locally they call each. She would call them Anna. Suresh Anna, please arrange this. So that is how it is. That's what I observed.
Right. And one final question from posted anonymously: is it safe for a researcher to point to elites, for example, elected people, that they're involved in corrupt activities like commissions and all? So, yeah, I think this is more of a method.
Yeah. So the thing is that at least in my experience, I understand. So I developed a familiarity whereby they knew that I'm a researcher. But I kept emphasizing that I'm not interested particularly as an audit person trying to find faults with what you are doing. I'm trying to understand the more general ways things happen. And that really helped. And they were actually very happy to share, that, the commission, these people are asking 15% commission is okay, but they have begun to ask 18% commission. Don't you think it's unfair? Now, there were all those chats. And I try to ensure that I don't have any images, don't take, I keep the confidentiality and anonymity of them.
So, okay, I think over to you now, Nupur.
I will keep my comments short. I just want to begin by saying that I really, really enjoyed reading this paper. And I feel like it sits at the intersection of multiple questions and communities and angles in terms of academic work. So, one could look at what Rajesh just described and really sort of talk about so many different issues at play here. I have to say that, Rajesh, the way you presented the paper, I mean, when I read it, I didn't feel like we were talking about a data economy that has also come into being alongside, the actual economy of work and things like that. So maybe there's something worth reflecting and discussing about later, but I'll just sort of quickly flag points. Is that just based on your presentation, I certainly felt like data was really doing the job of sort of being a currency of some sort that sits atop other forms of information exchange, other forms of information recording, and who can withhold data, who can record data, and then the ways in which data is being then collected and produced in the form of a narrative that is compliant to the top level administrative needs seems to have in itself created this one more layer of sort of gratitude and beneficiaries and relationships where, say in the village space, how people might have related to each other in terms of thinking about power has also changed, because now you suddenly realize who are these new actors that you need to pay attention to or be good friends with and so on, if you want to embed yourself in this economy. Having said that, the paper and the way in which the paper situates itself within the literature review had gotten me thinking along slightly different lines, right? Because your paper sort of seems to be in conversation with data justice and the ways in which data justice has been thought about and talked about. And that also resonated with me a lot, especially the 2 points, I think, where you said end and then talk about your data, which is that it's not enough to focus just on data quality and then inaccuracies in data. And I'm absolutely with you. I agree. I feel like so overall, I'm these are all sort of provocative reflections that I'm giving out unfiltered, but my sense is that once we start talking about data and then data justice, we're already not even sort of looking at or paying attention to the justice part, to the people for whom a system like this should work, regardless of whatever tools and instrumentation is being put in place. So in that sense, there's a meta point about how conversations of data themselves are distracting from the questions of social power and so on and so forth. And having said that, then it's a slippery slope, because once we say data justice, there are a lot of these questions about, quality of data, the digital divide or the data divide, inaccuracies of data, but also, at least my sense is that we kind of don't realize when words like transparency and efficiency slip in as common and shared goals. Because one of those premises of digitalization in all sorts of projects is that why is it such a big social good, right? Like, it is because it is going to bring about transparency, efficiency in public welfare systems, which apparently is a goal that we all agree to, from the most marginalized wage seeker to the top level official. And once we get into the nitty gritties of it and we stop looking at it from the perspective of shared data or information goals, it quickly, like you said, who's driving this and whose data and whom does it matter to, it quickly becomes these fractured projects that are in fact assimilated under the banner of data driven governance. So it would certainly do us well as researchers as well to perhaps shift the emphasis from data to governance. And that's why I loved the fact of that, you kept alluding to pre-digital governance and studies around that, because something that I've been thinking about a lot as I like sort of read and reread, some classic anthropology work such as Akhil Gupta's work on bureaucracy and red tape, or more recently Tarangini Sriraman's book on ID and documentation. Is this is this constant notion of how there's always an economy underneath this top level mandate. Not rambling too much, I'll say two things. One is that while you're giving clarificatory answers, I sort of realized something, which is that there might also be um, might also be the work of a certain vision being put into place in terms of who wants to see how much. There's a clear visuality being produced in this case. So, it's and that's why again, like I tend to veer more towards the seeing all of these actors and seeing also the configuration that you talked about, not as the lack of efficiency or the breakdown of a system, but rather very, very careful ways of managing a system, producing a system that apparently is multifaceted and in some ways even contradictory, but is also operating at least two different ends where it seems to work for those under it as well as those above it. And so I think there's something there to be said. And I don't think you meant it in that way, but collusion, and this is the academic in me talking, is that work like this coming out from the global south always has that risk or that extra burden of having to explain that whether be it corruption or be it collusion, which in its simplest sense can also be called a creative collaborative tactic and so on and so forth, is not an exception. It is perhaps the norm in large scale systems per se across the world, definitely where majority of us live. And so, when we don't acknowledge it and frame it in that way, then collusion becomes a sort of exception or becomes a lag or a deficiency that only plagues, so-called developing countries and their governance projects. So I even got, like, when I was reading your paper, it occurred to me again and again that what is going on, what you discovered, seems, I mean, it could actually be used to very generatively, very productively think through the fact of how data governance pans out and what kinds of shared responsibilities different actors undertake, realizing that this system is built in a way that it was never supposed to keep them at the center of it, right? And then one last final point that I wanted to share was also, yeah, so your paper, I think in the beginning hints at, the practices of producing data or the data production as a very political process. And I feel like the paper sort of labors to try and show that. And then you conclude by saying that, your emphasis is that far from apolitical, data production is both social and also political. I would ask you to go a step further and make a bolder claim, because after reading your paper, my sense is that, again, this is a bit of an academic problem, which is that in the times that we exist, it seems to be almost non controversial to say that something is political. And this is more of a science studies issue. So, technology is political, and this is political, and AI is political. But what does it mean to say that something is political? That is one. And secondly, one risks sort of misunderstanding that, in this case, the large scale information system exists and then it has political ramifications or it has political effects and it has social effects and so on. I would say that is not the case. Based on reading your paper, my understanding is that such a system would never be made functional in these multiple ways for multiple actors without its enmeshment, without it percolating and being reconfigured through its social context, through its actors at the local level, through those processes of collusion or whatever they are called, collusion. So in that sense, those are not bugs, or that those are not even unintended or incidental effects, but that they are necessarily sort of, it is co-constituted or it is inherently constituted through the social context, actors, the cultural norms of it, and so on and so forth. And I feel like that might shift the emphasis a little bit again from this largely data driven narrative, which, like, even the critiques seem to be data driven. So we never move past some of the more technocratic and data first visions of how these things could even be fixed. So, and then, you know, I'm not an expert by any means on data justice literature, although I've read a bit of it. But I would, when I read a field study like this, it really makes me wonder how one might create a bridge between a field study like this and something that is way more high level, talking about, you know, the more abstract principles of data justice, or a participatory approach, or, you know, what does it mean to be community stewards of data and things like that. Um, if one is not able to talk about the fact that we're not talking about benevolent actors, or one isn't just talking about a community that is completely in sync, right? We're talking about an active field of power that has existed before this system got implemented. So that is kind of where I would ask you to even make it bolder as a claim and talk about the fact that information systems are only inherently made functional through a reconfiguration of the politics of the social context and so on and so forth. Yeah, these are all the comments that I really had. Regarding the last point, I think you guys are already aware of it, but anthropologist Julia Eliachar did this fantastic study and book on microfinance and the social and communicative labor that women undertook in Egypt, in Cairo. And her point kind of, you know, her book largely revolves around this point that shifts the emphasis from asking whether microfinance empowered women to rather focusing on how microfinance as a success story was only made possible through the kind of labor, phatic labor, what she calls, that women undertook in those cases, through the relationships that they had. So yeah, I will definitely link people to it, but I'll stop here.
Thank you, Nupur. I think all the questions you raised were so pertinent. And, you know, I'd just like to add that, you know, to kind of how do you show that, you know, this is not a bug of the system or bug to the system exception, but rather an inevitability of the system, is not just, I would say, like, it's not something that's only coming from like an academic position or, you know, that's driving this interest, but I would say that, you know, it's also the pursuit of this question, and to kind of also show it in, you know, in different domains and contexts, is really important as a political project as well. Because as I was reading this paper, you know, one of the feelings that, and often when you hear about, you know, any kind of data governance systems, you are already captured by this feeling of the fact that we are very fast moving down this trajectory already. And in some senses, the future is already decided. And then often the conversation then becomes about how do we steer this trajectory, or how do we tweak it so that it's more just and more fair and more transparent and so on and so forth, and leaves like no room to question any kind of alternatives. So I think that's really important, and the points you raised. So Rajesh and Janaki, would you like to respond to Nupur first? And I, you know, while we wait for a couple more questions to come in.
Do you want to go first, Rajesh?
Sure. I am just thinking out loud. So these are also going to be pretty much ramblings. Yeah, so one thing that, you know, the visuality that Nupur was speaking about, right? So that resonates a lot with me. You know, somewhere, I'm not sure how, but somewhere it becomes that more data and more real-time data and a lot of data, we often confuse it for, it gives us a sense of, you know, comfort that there is so much that can be done about it. So, so there is definitely that visual aspect of it, and the dashboards add more to those kinds of you know, comforts, that we know what is happening. So that is definitely one significant part of it, which obscures the everyday processes and everyday practices. Now, with the information system, so to speak, I think that was a very interesting comment of how these a lot of these practices have always been there, and it is not as if the information system. I think there are a lot of mixed intents. I'm not very sure what is actually the intent of the information system designers. I definitely want to go that step. Uh, but one of the jokes that I often heard in a lot of these activist circles is that every technology is introduced so that one key official gets an award, right? So that we have something new, something fancy. However, one thing that I definitely want to not say is that I don't want to say that the higher officials are indifferent. A lot of them are not naive. They understand the everyday practices. They understand the politics, and for them, probably their thinking, in my understanding, is that I can't fix that, so let me at least do this. Right, and some of these practices have some ramifications. For example, this and that might be, I don't know whether what part of it is intended, what part of it is unintended. For example, this idea of direct benefit transfer, that definitely complicated some of the elite who have been in operational for at least 15 years, 20 years. They were saying that earlier it was easy, now it is going to be a little difficult. And and especially when government shifted from joint account for a family to every person having an individual account, they said it becomes even more complicated. So there are certain side effects. I do see that there is some pushback from people with good intentions, uh, but I definitely don't have an answer of what next, right? So it is a messy problem. But one thing that definitely we want to do is to acknowledge that it is pretty messy, and there is more to it than what meets the eye in those columns and rows.
Thanks so much for those comments, Nupur. And I think I especially appreciate the comment around not seeing this as a bug and seeing how the sort of tapestry of relationships and managing how this works is inherent to the whole project, and sort of in a James Ferguson kind of a way. It's building up an edifice that it's meant to build up, and it's absolutely not a failure from that point of view. I think what is interesting though for me in all of this is, of course, Rajesh did all of the field work, but you can see how engagingly he presents it to you. So I have many memories of many times when he came back saying, should I be going to this village, are they going to beat me up? And this guy charmingly basically there was one guy, apparently Rajesh should tell the story, but he had such a great rapport with him that he actually gave him pretty much a rate card for how what is the breakup of the different costs involved and so on and so forth. So from hearing a lot of those, I think what is equally interesting to me is like you said, not just the data production is political, etc., but how that enmeshes itself in particular places, right? Especially for a project like NREGA, which right off the bat is supposed to cover the entire country, various jurisdictions, etc., etc. What it actually means, and even this intended ecology that you're talking about, has to obviously be different in different places, right? So it's not so much intended from either the policy designer or tech designer in one particular way, but there is space for it, and then it sort of builds itself up as a constellation in a particular place with its particular histories, etc. So in that sense, I think while being cognizant of the fact that this is not a bug, but in some ways inherent, I think how it plays out in practice in a particular place, I think tells us a lot about how that works. So that's one thing. The other thing about the data focus, I appreciate your point about how, even though we are talking about how data obscures certain things, maybe framing it in terms of data again obscures a bunch of other things which will be relevant. I think one thing that's worth looking at though is there's this almost the sort of data determinism that's going on, right? I mean, in a way, data determinism is even harder to parse, I think, than something like tech determinism, because it's also in a way beyond material form. And 10 years back, it was information that was supposed to be free and liberated. Now it's data that's free and liberated, so material form doesn't matter, etc. But because of that sort of data determinism, I think it's useful to keep your eye on data, because it's through data that a bunch of other things get obscured. So I think as a methodological device, almost following data seems to make some sense. But I see your point about how, and sort of excess focus on that obviously takes away from other places. One other thing which I'm also not entirely sure how it ties directly to your comments, but I have a feeling that it does. And Rajesh and I were discussing this earlier, so I'll just bring that up, is this whole question of scaling, right? Which comes up with technology projects anyway, but I feel like it comes up even more when we are talking about data, and even more when we are talking about data in the context of a national scheme like NREGA, right? So data, where was I going with this? I think I was trying to connect this to the whole issue of scaling. And again, it's not just that data production is important and happened in a particular way in this place. We're not arguing, obviously, that it's going to happen similarly in all places, but just that site of data production itself needs to be looked at, precisely because of how diverse it is, despite the fact that a centralized database like this gives you an illusion of homogeneity, also in the way it gets picked up and you make decisions, etc. So that becomes another, these to me seem like a few reasons why data is a productive entry point. But beyond that, I completely agree with what you're saying about not letting it sort of obscure our vision. But thanks, those are great comments, and I'll also go back to Julia LHR and get something out of that again.
I'll
Thanks,
just
Nidhi.
add to your scale comment. I've been thinking about it a lot as well. And recently, I'll bring you the reference, but I saw somewhere someone had written in a paper or something, um, where, so there, I think coming from the sort of human computer interaction community, there's always that charge against, especially qualitative researchers, right? In terms of like, how does this answer, or at least how does this relate to systems that are built at scale? And there is, the critique that I read was about the fact that, this emphasis on scale in a particular way of thinking of scale is also one of like techno-capitalist imagination of scale, because uh, I guess it would work well to think back and say, who said that things have to work at scale in that sense? And how is it at odds with the ways in which we imagine systems to work, and what they're supposed to do? Like, why is there an obsession in terms of how things are going to be rolled out at scale and so on? And the second one that comes to mind is Hannah Apple's book, Licit Life of Capitalism, which has recently come out. And in the introduction itself, there is this few paragraphs where she basically goes in and out of the field, which is Equatorial Guinea's oil rigs, which are like offshore. And she engages a lot with what that scale is doing to her. Like, what does it mean to sit in a helicopter and see something from the top, and then zoom into it, and then go down, and then deal with people and their lives and all of that, and constantly come in and out of it? And how do we think more productively as anthropologists, rather than sort of the more superficial dismissal of both the rhetoric of scale, saying, oh, well, we've heard this argument, and also the fact that what the visuality again of scale is doing to us when we're trying to parse through data narratives. So those might be helpful as well.
I think there was this paper, and I don't know if this is the one you're talking about, called Against Scale, Provocations and Resistances to Scale Thinking, which was written by Alex Hanna and Tina M. Park. I'll post it here. That might also be an interesting reference to look into.